Today I'm going to talk about homeostasis, in particular blood glucose regulation and bank Voles. But first let's start with homeostasis. Homeostasis is basically a mechanism to maintain a constant internal environment, and it can be maintaining blood glucose levels, body temperature, osmotic balance, blood pressure, or the level of respiratory gases. The way it works is by using negative feedback mechanisms, but I'll come to this later. As I already mentioned, I'm going to focus on the maintenance of blood sugar levels today. So first of all, why is glucose so important? Well, in the process of cellular respiration, glucose is transformed into ATP. This produces heat, so it's essential for keeping the body's temperature constant. But most importantly, glucose is the body's #1 source of energy. It's like fuel for the body. But why do we have to keep it at a constant level? Wouldn't it be great to just have heaps of glucose in our blood? Well, no, it wouldn't. Because if the glucose level is too high, glucose molecules attach to proteins and damage them. This is called glycation. On the other hand, if there's too little glucose in the blood, the brain has insufficient energy to function, so it starts to shut down less important parts, which can lead to coma. Also, the body is unable to maintain the body temperature, as respiration, as well as any other chemical reaction, is slowed down due to a lack of energy. This is actually true for any animal, but let's use the example of bank voles. Here's some general information about bank voles. They're about 10 centimeters long, with a tail half their body size. Their fur has a red-brownish color with some grey patches. They mainly live in woodland areas, and they are mostly vegetarian, feeding on fruit, seeds, leaves, fungi, roots, grass, buds, and moss, but they also feed on some invertebrate food like snails, worms, or insects. Bank voles don't hibernate and show a nocturnal activity pattern in summer, whereas they're active both day and night during winter. As explained previously, it is important for every animal to keep the glucose level in the blood within a certain range. If too much sugar or carbohydrates are taken in, the blood glucose level rises and damage is done to important proteins, while hypoglycemia, which means too little glucose in the blood, for example because the animal hasn't eaten in a long time, can cause coma as the brain needs glucose to work. So how do bank voles control their blood glucose level? Let me explain it with this diagram. This is how every homeostatic mechanism works. It's the negative feedback loop. It starts at the bottom, here, where my mouse is, where we have a variable. If this variable is off balance, a so-called receptor, here, detects the change, passing the information on to the control center, here, at the top, which then sends signals to the effector, here. The effector then responds to bring the variable back to balance. In our case, the variable is the blood sugar level, glucose level in the blood. So if the vole has too much or too little glucose in its blood, the pancreas detects it. In response, it produces hormones, which act in the liver, where glucose is stored in the form of glycogen. This diagram here is a little bit more exact. So if the level of glucose is too high, glucose increase. The upper circle comes into force. So when detecting a large amount of glucose, the pancreatic beta cells are stimulated to produce insulin, the hormone insulin, which then acts in the liver, transforming glucose into glycogen, the storable form of glucose. However, if the blood glucose level is too low, the hormone glucagon is produced in the pancreatic alpha cells, and this has the opposite effect to insulin in the liver, transforming glycogen back into glucose. The adaptive advantage of this mechanism is pretty obvious. The liver acts as a storehouse for glycogen, so glycogen is the storage form of glucose. So the bank voles can feed in advance and store energy. If they didn't have this homeostatic mechanism, the bank will constantly have to eat tiny amounts of glucose in order to keep the concentration in the blood in balance. The glucose homeostasis helps them keep their blood glucose level in a range where proteins are not damaged by hyperglycemia, but they have enough energy to keep their metabolic pathways in an optimal level. Disruption of glucose homeostasis is most commonly studied in the field of diabetes. There are two types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is the more natural one and more common than type 2 in wild animals, and it's also the more dangerous one, as the body's own autoimmune system attacks and destroys the pancreas. This form of diabetes is not caused by diet, and it's often linked to other autoimmune diseases such as MS. It is an internal disruption, as it's a genetic disorder other than type 2 diabetes, which is external, and it's caused by diet. In type 2 diabetes, normally the pancreatic alpha cells don't receive the information to shut down the production of glucagon, and the body's cells are immune to insulin, normally because they're just used to a high insulin level. So the body is not only unable to bring down the glucose level after a meal, but keeps transforming stored glycogen into glucose, increasing the glucose level in the blood even more. In type 2 diabetes, the body is simply unable to produce insulin, and the production of glucagon is declining as well with time, as the pancreas is slowly destroyed. An interesting fact about type 1 diabetes is that regardless of the intake of glucose, the vole will die without daily injections of insulin, as every animal with a pancreas requires insulin in order to live. Thanks for listening.